Hello. In this video, I'm going to be discussing some key concepts from Chapter 4, specifically the unit of analysis and also the time dimension. So when we talk about the unit of analysis, remember that there are 4 units of analyses. There is the individual level, there is the group level, the organization level, and the social artifact. So when you look at a research study, one thing that you'll want to do is try and figure out what the unit of analysis is. The second thing that you'll want to figure out is the time dimension. So there's a time element to research as well. The time dimension can either be cross-sectional or longitudinal. If it's cross-sectional, that means data are collected at one point in time. If it's longitudinal, that means data are collected at multiple points in time. And there's some additional distinctions if you have a longitudinal study. So remember, longitudinal studies, according to the chapter, are either trend, cohort, or panel. And if they're panel, they're either prospective or retrospective. So this is key to the article critique project. In your article critique project, you're going to want to identify the unit of analysis. So you're going to tell me whether it is individual, group, organization, or social artifact. And you're also going to tell me what time dimension it is, whether it's cross-sectional or longitudinal. If it's longitudinal, you'll also want to indicate whether it's cohort, trend, or panel. And if it's panel, you'll want to say whether or not it's prospective or retrospective. Okay? And so I've given you some of the terminology, but if you need a refresher on that terminology, take a look at Chapter 4 because it explains what all these concepts mean. But anyway, let's get on with it. Let's see if we can figure out with our sample article here what the unit of analysis is and also what the time dimension is. Now, sometimes if you're lucky, an article will tell you what time dimension they're using and what unit of analysis they're using, but most of the time they don't give you that information. They expect you to know it or to infer it by reading the article. I've read this article numerous times, so I can tell you that they do not come out and tell you that information in the article. So what we need to do is scroll down to the methods section. And remember, the methods section is the meat and potatoes of the article because that explains how the study was done. So here's the methods section. And we'll just kind of read through this a little bit about how the study was done. The borough in which the data were collected has a higher proportion of elderly people, 23% than the national average. Okay, that's great. Generally, this group has a higher fear about crime. All right. Neighborhood Watch volunteers trained in survey and interview techniques administered surveys in 2 waves, one prior to community-oriented policing, in 1996, that was the pre-assessment, and one 6 months after it was implemented in 1998, that was the post-assessment. In the pre-assessment, participants were unaware of the COP strategies the local police were considering. For both surveys, respondents were told the surveys were primarily used to gather anonymous information regarding citizen perception of the police. Each wave involves surveys of 2 random samples of people. The first sample of each wave consists of community members who live in the immediate vicinity of a local park, an elderly apartment complex, blah, blah, blah. Approximately 90% of the area respondents agreed to participate in both waves, blah, blah, blah. The second sample in each wave focuses on people who live in the general borough population and have access to the park but do not live in its immediate vicinity. Since this is a much broader base, the intent was to sample 10% of the total borough population. Okay, so I feel like we have enough information here to figure this out. So first off, it sounds like they're surveying people that live near the park and also people that live away from the park. They talk about community members. All right. They talk about the population, 2 random samples of people, community members who live in the immediate vicinity of a local park. So we have to ask ourselves, what are community members? Are they individuals? Are they groups? Are they organizations? Or are they social artifacts? Well, in the context of this study, the whole point is that they were comparing two groups, and I just gave away the answer there, two groups of people. So they were comparing groups of people that live near the park, that was the treatment group, and groups of people that lived away from the park, that was the control group. And so the idea is if the problem oriented policing and community policing interventions were successful, we should see reductions of fear more so in the treatment group versus the control group. So again, these groups were drawn from the community. We're interested in treatment and control groups. So this is a group level comparison. So for the unit of analysis, um, it is a group level. Even though they were collecting data from individuals, they ultimately aggregated up to the group level to do the comparison. So again, it's a group level comparison, so the unit of analysis is the group level. Now, what about the time dimension? Well, there's a very key sentence here. Neighborhood Watch volunteers trained in survey and interview techniques administered surveys in two waves, one prior to community-oriented policing in 1996, the pre-assessment, and one 6 months after it was implemented in 1998, the post-assessment. So what this is telling us is that these surveys were administered twice. So automatically that makes it a longitudinal study because we have data collection at more than one point in time. Had they only done the survey once, it would be cross-sectional. But they're telling us here they collected data twice. Once prior to the community-oriented policing intervention, and then once after it was already underway. And this makes sense because the whole point of the study is to see if they do community-oriented policing at the park, will it reduce fear of crime in the community? All right. And so it makes sense that they would do data collection prior to the intervention with community policing and then after to see if it worked. So now that we know that it's longitudinal, is it trend, cohort, or panel? I'm going to argue that it is panel because they're interviewing the same subjects. So they tried to interview the same people at time one and then again at time two. And this makes sense because we want to see if people noticed a difference, if there is a reduction in fear. So that would make sense that you would interview the same people at two times. So we would say that this is a panel study. Now that we know it's a panel, we have to figure out, is it prospective or retrospective? Well, the difference is that prospective data collection is done over multiple points in time going forward. Retrospective data collection is done once, but we're asking people to remember events from the past. So we know data were collected twice, so therefore it would be a prospective panel. All right. So basically, that's it. Again, your article is probably going to look different than this. This is just some general examples and general rules. But again, you're going to be identifying the unit of analysis and the time dimension. So with your article, I want you to tell me what the unit of analysis is, whether it's individuals, whether it's groups like it was in this article, whether it was organizations, or whether it was social artifacts. Okay. You're also going to identify the time dimension. You're going to tell me first, was it cross-sectional or longitudinal? If your study was cross-sectional, that's done. That's all you need to say. However, if it was longitudinal, you're going to want to identify whether it was a trend study, a cohort study, or a panel study. And if it is a panel study, you're going to want to tell me if it's prospective or retrospective. Again, in this particular article, it was a longitudinal panel study and it was prospective in nature. We know this because it was the same, there were two attempts at data collection. The same people were interviewed over time, and it was not retrospective in the sense that they only had one data collection point and asked people to recall the past. They interviewed them once and then they interviewed them again a second time to see if anything changed between the two interviews. All right. So that pretty much sums it up. If you have any questions about this, feel free to shoot me an email and I would be happy to address them.